Blood gushed from Aisha's shoulder, leaving a red trail across the tiled ground, but she didn't take a single step back. The barrel of her gun stood upright, slicing through the silence of the street, her gaze locked onto the two cops like it was skinning them alive. Her voice was low and raspy, each word a blade. "I once blew a terrorist's skull open from 800 meters away. 2 pieces of trash like you. I could shoot just for fun and still hit." Mark turned pale, his lips split from biting down too hard, but he didn't dare blink with the barrel still aimed square at his forehead. The suburban street at midday resembled a still painting drenched in golden light. The asphalt simmered under the sun, reflecting streaks of sunlight cast from a nearly cloudless sky. On either side, old oak trees draped their shadows across the pavement, their leaves trembling lightly in the occasional breeze, producing a soft rustle that sounded like distant whispers. A stray cat stretched lazily on the porch across the street, its eyes half closed in that familiar summer indolence. All these details painted a sense of calm, a quiet day, where no one could have imagined that within seconds this peace would be torn apart. Aisha stood right in front of the small grocery shop run by the widowed old woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, a place where people often stopped by for a bottle of water, a few snacks, or sometimes just a quick chat. She was talking to a friend about small local happening. The garage owner's son just got into college. The little girl next door is learning to ride a bike, and the plan to plant more bougainvillea at the end of the street to brighten it up next spring. The way Aisha leaned against the doorframe, one hand absent-mindedly spinning the key in her pocket, showed she was completely at ease. Her friend, a middle-aged woman with voluminous curly hair, chuckled softly as they reminisced about the afternoons when the whole block gathered for backyard barbecues. They didn't notice that in the distance the sound of an engine was growing louder, urgent, and unnatural. That noise cut through the street's steady rhythm like a scratch across a spinning record. A white patrol car with blue stripes came speeding from the far end, its tires screeching as Mark behind the wheel slammed the brakes. The burning rubber let off a harsh stench, leaving behind 2 winding black streaks on the pavement. The car door flung open, and Mark stepped out first. His eyes didn't scan the area like an officer assessing a scene. They locked straight onto Aisha with a look soaked in contempt, his face tightened, lips curling into a cold smirk like someone convinced of his authority to pass judgment. Cole followed, stepping out with his hand resting loosely near his belt, where the butt of his gun peeked from under the strap. He said nothing, merely scanning Aisha from head to toe with a look that mixed mockery and a baseless kind of hostility. Their presence dragged a heaviness into the air as if the summer heat had suddenly thickened into something harder to breathe. Aisha and her friend felt it instantly. Her friend's stiffened eyes dimming slightly, as if instinct warned that any reaction now could become the excuse for something worse. Mark stepped closer, shrinking the space between him and Aisha, not to speak, but to impose. His voice rang out deliberately, louder than necessary so that not only Aisha, but anyone nearby could hear it. "People like this aren't allowed to stand here." Each word dropped with raw disdain, unfiltered. He didn't need to explain because the sentence itself was already a clear and final judgment. Aisha's friend stepped back, moving out of direct confrontation with the 2 officers. Aisha, instead of reacting immediately, stayed still, her eyes sharpening, never straying from their every move. She saw Mark's hand tighten slightly, saw Cole's quick glance toward his gun. Every detail registered in her mind the instinct of someone who had survived places where hesitation meant death. Cole remained silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. He seemed to be waiting for a cue or an invisible nod to act. Then everything happened in a split second, just long enough to shatter the street's fragile calm. Without warning, Cole raised his arm, the gun drawn so fast the sunlight hadn't even caught the steel before the crack of the shot tore through the air. The sound slammed against the brick walls, echoing back in a flat, harsh wave. The bullet sliced past Aisha's left shoulder, tearing through fabric and leaving a deep gash. The pain jolted through her like a live wire, running from her shoulder down her arm, and almost instantly, hot blood surged out, trailing downward, soaking her fingertips. Time slowed. Her friend screamed her name, but Aisha barely heard it. All she could register was the pounding of her heartbeat, her breath turning heavy and deep, though her eyes remained focused. Cole lowered his weapon, his lips twitching into something like satisfaction. But he didn't realize that smile would last only a heartbeat before it was choked by the weight of Aisha's stare locking onto him. It wasn't the look of someone cornered, but of someone who had walked through fire and come back from it, someone who knew exactly how quickly life could be taken with a single move. In that instant, the stench of gunpowder mixed with fresh blood and the thick summer heat forming an atmosphere so suffocating even the wind seemed to freeze. Somewhere nearby, a window clicked shut. A figure retreated into shadow. The street's quiet had vanished completely, replaced by a heavy tension that gripped every sound and every movement, holding everything in place as if waiting for the next second to drop. And Aisha knew with certainty the next second would not belong to silence. Blood from the wound on her shoulder kept running down in red streaks threading through the veins of Aisha's arm, but she didn't tremble. The pain spread slowly burning, yet her mind had never been clearer. The instant the bullet grazed her, everything around her shattered into fragments, leaving only a raw primal survival instinct surging up full force. She stepped back once, just enough to gain distance and assess the scene, and her right hand moved precisely to where it needed to be, the place where she kept a piece of her past few ever knew about. The handgun was compact, perfectly weighted, and drawn smoothly from a holster hidden in her waistband. There was no hesitation in the motion, no delay from pain or shock, only precision and ease, like a reflex etched into her muscles. As her finger slid into the trigger guard, her eyes locked on the target. Not Cole, who had just pulled the trigger, but Mark, the one standing closer still, believing he controlled the situation. He flinched slightly at the sight of the weapon, but the arrogance hadn't yet left his face. That was the moment Aisha spoke, her voice low and steady, each word slicing through the thick air. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence already passed. The words made Mark's face shift, his eyes blinking quickly as if brushing against a truth he hadn't expected. Aisha's gun pointed directly at his chest, her wrist steady as steel without a tremor. Her stance radiated complete control, like every exit had already been sealed and one more move would take everything to a place no one could return from. Cole, realizing the balance had flipped faster than breath, turned slightly toward Mark, searching for a signal, but Mark was locked in Aisha's sides, too frozen to step forward or draw his weapon again. From a distance, murmurs started to ripple out like fire catching dry grass. A few windows creaked open. Faces appeared for seconds before ducking back, yet no one looked away from the center of the street. Then, as if on cue, from the times they lived in, a few phones lifted into the air lenses aimed at Aisha and the two officers. The soft clicks of shutters, the buzz of recording apps, the faint beeps of live streams layered into the tense silence. Everyone holding a phone understood they were witnessing a moment that could soon consume the entire city, maybe even the country. A young man near the bus stop held his phone with trembling hands, not from fear, but from knowing he was capturing living proof. An old woman at the corner clutched her device to her chest, eyes fixed on the scene. Aisha registered all of this at the edge of her vision, but she didn't waver. In combat, she had learned to let the outside world fade until only what mattered to survival remained in sharp focus. Mark no longer wore the smirk he had earlier. Sweat had started to bead at his temples, and his hand, resting on the grip of his gun, had slipped slightly. His eyes tried to hold to their firmness, but cracks had begun to show. Cole stood angled, trying to mask his unease, but that only made him look like a cornered animal searching for a way out. The air was so heavy that every breath seemed amplified. A sudden chirp from a sparrow on the power line startled a few onlookers. The harsh sunlight poured down, making the blood on Aisha's shirt glisten, sharpening the intensity of the moment. She shifted her stance slightly, adjusting her balance for the optimal shooting position, keeping Mark in sight without losing track of Cole. Time stretched, each second swollen with the threat of eruption. The crowd remained silent, but that silence grew deafening because everyone could feel how thin the line was between the present and a disaster separated by a single pull of a trigger. In that moment, no one remembered the peace of the neighborhood from just minutes before. Now, all were drawn into the gravity of a standoff that could redefine everything about power, life, and justice. Aisha stood firm, her breathing steady, her gaze like a blade pinning its prey. And Mark, for the first time that afternoon, realized he was no longer in control of anything. Mark stood across from Aisha, his whole body stiff as stone, yet his eyes still flickered with provocation. He forced the corner of his mouth into a sneer, the kind of smirk worn by someone who believed the badge on his chest gave him the power to make anyone bow. "Who do you think you are? Planning to shoot a cop?" His voice wasn't loud, but every word carried clearly to the crowd surrounding them. That tone held contempt laced with mockery, like a stone tossed into a still lake, hoping the ripples would shake the other side. A few people in the crowd hissed under their breath, not because they were taking sides, but because the tension had reached a level that felt dangerously close to snapping. Aisha didn't respond right away. She let his words hang in the air, forcing Mark to hear his own voice echo into the weighty silence. Her breathing was slow and deep, like she was measuring heartbeats and gauging distances. She stepped forward, once each move steady and unwavering, never shifting her aim. The space between them had shrunk enough for Mark to see the blood still trickling from her shoulder, the red gleaming under the harsh midday sun, throwing off a glare that was hard to look at. Aisha's voice dropped quiet, but sharp enough to strike every nerve. "If my life stays in danger, I'll end it right here." The calm in her voice made the words more terrifying, like a verdict that needed no further proof. The air turned heavy as lead. Every day, sounds of the neighborhood seemed to vanish. Then, from the crowd, an elderly voice rang out, rough but strong. A small-framed woman stood on the sidewalk with a wooden cane, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "Stop it! What are you doing? This is our street, not a place for killing." Her voice cracked but held firm, causing several in the crowd to hold their breath. Someone raised a phone higher, the lens shaken slightly with the pulse of the one recording, as if everyone understood this moment would be captured forever. Cole remained slightly behind Mark, his eyes locked on Aisha without blinking. He held his gun firmly, the barrel lowered slightly but still ready to act in an instant. His trigger finger hovered the muscles in his arm and shoulder pulled tight like wires, sweat trailing from his temple down his cheek and onto his neck. Cole knew this was no longer a routine stop or intimidation tactic. This was a standoff where the slightest wrong move would spill blood in front of dozens of witnesses. Aisha held her stance, the gun barrel fixed in the space between her and Mark as if welded there. She felt the burning sunlight scrape across her back, heard the wind carrying the fumes of car exhaust and the metallic sting of her own blood. In her mind, combat instincts forged through thousands of hours of training fired like lightning. Every motion from Mark and Cole was broken down into possible outcomes, and each one pointed to a decision where lives hung in the balance. Mark swallowed hard, trying to mask it by tilting his head slightly to one side, but his eyes couldn't hide the wavering inside. Cole glanced toward the crowd, as if weighing whether to shoot or step back, but hesitated with every phone camera now pointed directly at him. No one said another word yet. The silence was more terrifying than any shout. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, when the wind dies and every living thing holds its breath. In the middle of the street at noon, harsh light poured down on tense faces. Aisha didn't look around, but she knew every eye in the neighborhood was watching. They weren't just seeing a confrontation. They were witnessing the line being drawn between power and justice right there in real time. She didn't need their support, but she knew their presence meant Mark and Cole couldn't pull the trigger as easily as they might on someone faceless and alone. The gap between life and death is now measured no more than a single breath, a twitch of the hand, or even a blink at the wrong moment. But Aisha, with the experience of a former Delta Force operative, was no stranger to moments like these, and she also knew that this time, if they made the wrong choice, the price would be paid instantly in broad daylight in front of everyone. Mark tilted his head, his eyes still trying to project defiance even as sweat began to form on his palms. He took a short breath as if to summon enough courage to push through the silence that had stretched on. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he spat out a slur, his voice emphasizing each word clearly enough for everyone around to hear. "People with your skin shouldn't be standing here." It wasn't a shout, but a cold blade slicing through the air, cutting deep into the contempt he had hidden beneath his uniform. He wanted to wound her, to strike at her pride and shatter the calm she had maintained. Those close by heard it clearly, and a few eyes in the crowd flashed with anger, but no one stepped in. They knew this wasn't just an argument, it was a battle of wills reaching the point of no return. Aisha stared directly at Mark, unblinking. She let his words fall into the void, then slowly lifted her chin, forcing him to face her gaze head-on. Blood still flowed from her shoulder, each drop burning as it slid down her arm, but the pain only made her reply colder. "I've heard that from enemies," her voice lowered, steady as footsteps in a dark hallway, and they didn't live to say it again. Each syllable dropped slowly, but with a weight that slammed into Mark's ears, making his jaw tighten without him realizing. This was no longer instinct. It was the kind of warning anyone who had seen combat would recognize, the final line before bullets fly. The air seemed compressed thick enough that every chest in the crowd felt heavier. There was no wind, and even the sound of distant traffic seemed muted. Only the pounding of hearts remained, each beat echoing in its owner's head. Aisha's remained steady as if she were at a shooting range, but Mark's pounded hard, and Cole, even off to the right, felt dangerously close to the edge. The silence wasn't empty. It carried a pressure no one dared cut through. Even the old woman, who had shouted earlier, stayed silent now, eyes fixed, her hand gripping her cane tightly. From behind the crowd, a witness stepped forward, perhaps driven by the sense that whatever was coming needed to be captured more closely. He was a middle-aged man, holding his phone with the camera already recording. He said nothing, just moved forward a few steps and raised the device to eye level. The lens pointed straight at the three people at the center, where gun barrels and locked stairs held the line. In frame, the smallest details were visible: a bead of sweat sliding down Cole's temple, the blood-stained patch on Aisha's shirt, and the slight tremble in Mark's fingers, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. Aisha glanced briefly at the man, not seeking support, but registering one more factor in the overall landscape. She knew that every second passing here, every word spoken, every minor gesture was being recorded, and would not be erased or distorted once this scene left the street. She turned back to Mark, and in her eyes now was no longer the flash of anger, but a dangerous stillness, the kind that comes from someone who knows they hold complete control. Mark swallowed dryly, but still tried to keep his voice steady. "You think you scare me?" Yet the tone had shifted, losing the confidence it once carried, like someone realizing too late they had crossed a line with no path back. Cole shot a glance at Mark, then locked his focus back on Aisha. In his mind, a surge of chaotic thoughts rose. This was no longer a situation they were in control of. The presence of a witness with a camera, the frozen crowd, and a woman whose limits he couldn't predict. It all made his grip tighten harder around the gun. But even in that readiness, he felt one thing with absolute clarity. If he pulled the trigger now, he wasn't sure he'd be the one walking off this street alive. For a stretch of time that felt endless, no one moved. The sunlight bore straight down, casting the shadows of the three figures onto the pavement, long, tense, and stretched thin like the moment itself. In the middle of those shadows, the man with the phone kept his camera steady while the heartbeat of the crowd around them seemed to sink into one, waiting to see if the next sentence would spark it all. Aisha took a deep breath, but her shoulders didn't drop and the barrel of her gun stayed fixed with her line of sight. In that look, Mark could read the final message: the line had been reached and the next move was his, but the cost would be immediate. The thick tension between the three was torn apart in a fraction of a second. Cole, eyes wide and hands slick with sweat, suddenly pulled the trigger, the bullet ripping through the air toward Aisha. The sharp crack of the shot echoed across the street, already strung tight like a wire. Aisha didn't respond with panic, but with instinct honed through thousands of hours, surviving life-or-death moments. Her body tilted right 1 foot, stepping back just enough to create space, and the bullet grazed her sleeve, slamming into the brick wall behind her, leaving a dent and a burst of dust like a grim whisper of death barely missed. Her eyes locked on Cole, no longer scanning the scene, but zeroed in on the threat that had triggered the kill order in her mind. The motion that followed was so fluid the onlookers hadn't even blinked before her gun lowered her wrist steady as iron, and she fired a clean, precise shot. The bullet struck the ground less than a hand's width from Cole's boot, sending up dirt and debris that stung his shins. The impact jolted him, knocking him off balance. His legs buckled and he fell backward, one arm still trying to grip his weapon, but his wrist now trembling uncontrollably. Mark stood off to the left, frozen in that instant. His eyes locked on the spot where the bullet hit, and his brain didn't need anyone to explain what that shot could have been. Straight thus through his partner's shin bone, or worse. A cold rush ran down his spine, triggering tiny spasms in the fingers wrapped around his gun. He stepped back instinctively, but the retreat did nothing to make him feel safer. Instead, it exposed his hesitation in front of the crowd and the cameras still rolling. His face drained of color, skin stretched tight under the midday sun, and his lips pressed together, trying to hold back a word that never came. The already tense atmosphere exploded as the crowd reacted in a chain reaction. Shouts burst out, tearing apart the silence. Some people stepped back in unison, partly to get out of the line of fire, partly to widen the frame for their phone cameras. Footsteps clattered, voices overlapped. Someone shouted, "Get down," while another screamed, "Back up, back up." A young woman clutched her child and ducked behind a row of parked cars. An old man, leaning against a wall, shook his head slowly, his eyes shifting from Mark to Aisha, then landing on Cole, now scrambling to sit up, his face twisted in shock and humiliation. Aisha held her ground, her breathing steady, the barrel of her gun still aimed forward low enough not to provoke further, but unmistakably ready. In that moment, every movement around her seemed to slow down. The shouting filtered through her awareness like distant echoes, unable to pierce the sharp focus she maintained on the two men before her. She knew the message she had just sent couldn't be misunderstood. She was not the prey being hunted. She was the one who would decide when the hunt ended. Mark swallowed dryly, feeling every pulse pounding in his chest. He tried to tighten his grip on the gun, but his hand was slick with sweat. Cole, still leaning against the wall, drew a deep breath before pushing himself up, no longer carrying the confidence he had when stepping out of the car. He shot a quick glance at Mark, looking for some kind of signal, but all he saw was his partner's face stretched with pressure. The noise from the crowd hadn't died down. If anything, it grew louder as more people moved in from a distance, wanting to see it all with their own eyes. That chaos became an advantage for Aisha, creating a human buffer that forced Mark and Cole to think twice before making any move. In the crowd, phone lenses and cameras flashed constantly, adjusting focus. Short video clips had already started to circulate. Within minutes, the entire incident would be flooding social media. At the center of it all, Aisha remained silent, her eyes frozen and sharp, delivering both a warning and a challenge. She knew a warning shot wasn't just to halt aggression, it could also tear apart the illusion of control that someone clung to. And in the moment Mark hesitated, Cole hit the ground and the shouts surged around them. That illusion began to crack. The noise at the scene hadn't died down yet when, at a corner of the neighborhood, a young man in a gray t-shirt stepped back against the wall, still holding his phone in recording mode. He tapped quickly a few times, adjusting the title and typing in keywords that had just flashed through his mind, then hit upload. The video was exactly 20 seconds long, capturing the moment. Aisha dodged the bullet and fired back at the ground near Cole's feet with the crowd's shouts rising in the background. As soon as the uploading message disappeared, he knew he had just dropped a spark onto dry grass in the digital space. Within 10 minutes, the first notification lit up. 1, then 3, then dozens of likes, comments, and shares started flooding in. The numbers climbed so fast that the phone vibrated lightly in his hand. TikTok's algorithm quickly picked up on the unusual engagement and pushed the video to the For You pages of countless users. The hashtag #AishaKane lit up the trending board like a flare, rising to the top spot in under an hour. At the same time, clipped versions of the original video began appearing across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, each platform adding captions and commentary of its own, turning a suburban street incident into a nationwide flashpoint. Beneath the original post, an avalanche of comments rolled upward like a river current. One user at Urban Eye left a remark that gained thousands of likes. She should have hit his leg, save him the chance to pull the trigger again. Right below, another replied, "If it were me, I'd have gone harder." Support for Aisha poured in, mixed with calls for a formal investigation into the actions of Mark and Cole. More and more users began to see this not just as a personal standoff, but as living proof of long-standing abuse of power and racial bias. But social media is never one-sided. Defenders of the police quickly appeared, firing back with crude language and familiar narratives. "We don't know the full story," one anonymous account wrote, followed by a stream of angry emojis. Others accused Aisha of threatening officers' lives, claiming her warning shot was excessive force. These comments weren't just defending Mark and Cole, but attempting to reframe the incident to make Aisha the aggressor. The clash in opinions turned the comment section into a second battleground where every sentence became a blade cutting into the opposing side's beliefs. Aisha's supporters began sharing more clips, including footage of Mark's slurs and the exact moment Cole fired first. Every image, every line of dialogue was zoomed in, slowed down, dissected like courtroom evidence. Meanwhile, those against her kept reposting shortcuts, focused only on Aisha, aiming her weapon, trying to paint her as the one who escalated the situation. Meanwhile, local news outlets began to take notice. Several freelance reporters, always quick to catch viral moments online, reshared the video with short captions like "Standoff in the suburbs, armed woman and police. What's the real story?" Headlines like that only fueled the public's curiosity, drawing more people to search for answers. Community Facebook groups in the area immediately lit up with posts asking questions, sharing witness accounts, and diving into heated debates about who was right and who was wrong. Within hours, the story outgrew its neighborhood origin and became a citywide topic. High-profile accounts started commenting, from social justice activists and civil rights attorneys to former military personnel who had either known or heard of the name Aisha Kane. One of her former teammates left a comment, "If they knew where she's been and what she's done, they wouldn't have dared raise a gun." That line was quickly screenshotted and spread like a cryptic clue, deepening the internet's fascination with Aisha's past. Amid the flood of opinions and information, the original clip continued racking up millions of views. Every frame became the subject of analysis videos, with streamers reacting in real time, breaking down every second, pausing on the expression on Mark's face, the sweat on Cole's temple, and Aisha's cold stare as she pulled the trigger. It was those small details that helped turn the story into a symbol of defiance and at the same time a thorn in the side of those unwilling to see authority challenged. In the real world, the street still bore scars from the confrontation, the bullet mark on the wall, the shattered brick fragments, the heavy air that lingered, but online, the event had already become a storm. Both sides believed they were defending what was right, and that divide kept the hashtag #AishaKane not only trending all day, but marked the beginning of a long fight with no clear end in sight. A thin layer of gray clouds blanketed the late afternoon sky, with the last weak sunlight glinting off rooftops. But the mood in the city was far from calm. In cafes, convenience stores, offices, and ordinary apartments, people stared at TV and phone screens waiting for the latest news about the event that had taken over the internet. As the familiar theme music played, the local news broadcast began with Aisha's image as the opening shot. Not the moment she was speaking to a friend, nor the instant the bullet grazed her shoulder. Instead, the frame showed only Aisha's cold eyes and her arm outstretched, gun pointed forward. The footage was abruptly cut, stripped of all prior context, and the anchor's serious tone followed two police officers in a suburban neighborhood faced an armed woman in what's being described as a serious threat to public safety. The entire report lasted less than a minute, but was enough to tell a completely different story. A few seconds of Mark and Cole were inserted standing in defensive positions, faces tense, eyes fixed off-screen as if danger was imminent. Background audio was added, muffled shouting, hurried footsteps, creating the impression that the officers were shielding civilians from a violent attacker. The screen then cut to the police department spokesperson, wearing a dark blue uniform with perfectly aligned buttons, standing before microphones and cameras. He spoke in a deep, firm voice. Our officers followed protocol. They had to protect the community from an armed individual. Every decision made was to safeguard lives. Those words, paired with the spliced footage, turned Aisha into a looming threat and cast Mark and Cole as responsible heroes. But not everyone bought the edit. Across the city, people watching TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook reopened the original clip they had saved earlier. In that uncut footage, the truth played out clearly and undeniably. Cole drew and fired first, the bullet grazing Aisha's shoulder, blood spreading across her shirt, followed by her response, a shot into the ground near his feet. Mark's slurs were audible through the background noise. Most importantly, the full sequence showed Aisha never initiated aggression. Online users began pushing back. Major accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers reposted the original video with captions like, "A direct challenge. Here's the part the news left out." Some broke down the footage frame by frame, highlighting the contradictions between the raw clip and the TV broadcast. Aisha hadn't been in the middle of the street, Mark had approached her aggressively, and Cole had clearly fired first. Some even created side-by-side comparison videos, edited report on the left, original footage on the right, so viewers could see the blatant differences for themselves. These images spread at lightning speed. Within an hour, dozens of posts titled "Media Manipulates the Truth" appeared across community groups, triggering thousands of angry comments. Some called for a boycott of the TV station, others demanded an independent investigation into the incident, and many insisted that those responsible for deliberately misleading coverage be fired or prosecuted. In a downtown cafe, a group of college students watched the video and discussed it heatedly, voices full of frustration. This channel's gone too far. If they wanted to defend the cops, at least do it based on facts. In a nearby apartment, a young mother feeding her child shook her head and murmured to her husband, "She got shot first. How can they report it like that?" Still, the pro-police side didn't stay silent. They seized on the local news report as a new weapon to reinforce their argument. In their forums, the edited footage circulated widely, accompanied by accusatory captions, "See, she pointed her gun first." Some even turned the news image of Aisha into memes mocking her to damage her credibility. From there, the online clashes escalated like never before. The two sides clashed without restraint. One posted more evidence from the original video, the other responded by questioning the clip's authenticity, even accusing it of being doctored to smear the police. Comments filled with rage, personal attacks, and even private details of individuals in the video were exposed, creating a toxic and extreme environment. Some, who had followed the story passively, were now dragged into the storm, forced to either take a side or quietly disappear. Through it all, Aisha Aisha remained silent. No posts, no interviews, no public rebuttals. But those who knew her understood this wasn't the silence of weakness. Her expression in the original video said it all, calm in control and unshakable. She knew that once the full truth emerged in a space where nothing could be hidden, that weight would come crashing down not only on the two officers, but also on those trying to twist the narrative. And by now, as the waves of debate surged across every platform, everyone could feel that this battle had grown far beyond a street corner incident. It had become a fight over truth, honor, and the trust of an entire community. With every hour that passed, the divide deepened, and with every hour, Aisha's image in the eyes of those who stood with her grew stronger and more resolute, a symbol no edited broadcast could erase. Social media was still locked onto the incident when an anonymous Twitter account suddenly posted a sharp, high-resolution photo of Aisha in full Delta Force uniform, combat insignia on her shoulder, eyes sharp as a blade. Behind her, the American flag waved faintly, along with a few fellow soldiers, all dressed in heavily decorated gear, evoking the feel of a classified mission only they truly understood. The caption was brief. You don't know who you just messed with. No explanation was needed. The photo alone landed like a gut punch to every smear that had come before. Less than 10 minutes later, the post's comment section exploded with questions, speculation, and above all, disbelief. Some thought it was fake until another account belonging to a veteran who had served in Delta Force stepped in to confirm. He wrote, "Yes, that's Aisha Kane. She led the hostage rescue op in Khost, Afghanistan. Not one of us got hurt, and every hostage made it home. She's the one we trusted with our lives." The statement was quickly quoted tens of thousands of times, flipping the story from a street standoff to a stunning revelation of identity. From there, the hashtag #XDeltaForce began to appear first in scattered comments, then spreading like fire through dry grass. People started pairing the military photo of Aisha with the video of her facing off against Mark and Cole, creating short clips with intense music. Titles like "The Warrior Returns" and "Not a Victim but a Living Legend" flooded every feed. Shares skyrocketed, bringing in millions of views within hours. This explosion of information put pro-police supporters in a tight spot. Earlier, they could rely on the edited news report to frame the story as armed citizen threatens officers. But now the photo and verified testimony from a former teammate had shattered that narrative. The image of a former Delta Force officer, part of one of the most elite units in the U.S. military, instantly gave Aisha undeniable credibility while casting the two officers as reckless and blind. The more details surfaced, the more the police department's silence became deafening. Independent journalists began calling, emailing, and messaging the department's communications office, but no one responded. The department's official Twitter account abruptly slowed its activity, posting only routine traffic alerts and public safety reminders. Meanwhile, in internal law enforcement forums, chatter turned to fears that this could go all the way to the Department of Defense, and that any false statement now could be used against us. Some leaks even suggested that the officers involved had been temporarily pulled from duty, though no official statement had been released. That silence only deepened public suspicion. People began comparing the police department's behavior in this case to others, pointing out how they were usually quick to hold press conferences, offer justifications, or even blame the other party. But this time, everything seemed to be held back by some invisible pressure. One bitter comment summed it up. Now that they've realized they messed with someone who used to lead Delta Force, they've suddenly learned what professional silence looks like. At home, Aisha skimmed through the circulating posts, her eyes showing little emotion. Those who knew her understood she never sought fame or admiration, but she also recognized that this unexpected reveal might completely shift public perception. In the messages from former teammates, most were words of support and encouragement. "We knew you wouldn't back down." Some came from families she had once rescued, recalling how their hearts stopped stopped when they saw the news, remembering the moment she emerged to pull them out of the dark. Outside, the national press began to take over. Major networks reached out for interviews, while journalists specializing in military and national security published in-depth pieces detailing the role and reputation of Delta Force. Some articles even cited missions Aisha had participated in within the limits of public information, but enough to paint the portrait of a seasoned soldier with iron resolve and first-hand experience in the harshest conditions. With each passing hour, the hashtag #Delta Force climbed higher on the trending chart. Edited clips combining images of Aisha in uniform with the moment she leveled her gun at Mark and Cole were shared relentlessly. Some accounts posted captions that were brief but powerful. "You picked the wrong target." And somewhere in the city, the people who had once mocked or attacked Aisha online began to fall silent. The pro-police voices, once loud in the early days, now nearly vanished from mainstream discussion. That unusual quiet to those who had followed many cases like this was the clearest sign yet of a crisis beginning to unfold. An identity bomb had just detonated, and its shockwave was not only shaking social media, it was beginning to threaten the very foundation of power they once believed unshakable. That morning, as waves of information continued flooding social media, a long post appeared on the personal page of someone claiming to be a retired police officer who had left the force over 10 years earlier. He opened without preamble, stating that he had served in the same precinct where Mark and Cole were currently assigned, and that he had followed Aisha's case from the very first hours. His tone was sharp, unflinching, refusing to soften the story. "I've seen enough to know that what's called protecting the community is sometimes just a glossy coat over actions that are flat out unacceptable." Each paragraph read like he was flipping through mental case files, holding the reader's attention without pause. He recounted the entire incident from the moment Mark and Cole's patrol car pulled up outside the store that day. Every detail was reconstructed through the lens of someone who knew proper protocol, who could distinguish reasonable actions from those that crossed the line. He broke down how Mark exited the vehicle with arrogance, how Cole immediately rested his hand on his weapon before there was any sign of a threat, and how their authority was used as a tool of domination. Small details like approach distance, Aisha's position, and the space between her and the firearm were recorded with clarity like a field report. But what truly shook readers was when he touched on the officer's past. With the authority of someone from inside the system, he recalled that Mark had once been under internal investigation for using excessive force during the arrest of a black teenager, a case that was closed quietly due to a key witness suddenly withdrawing testimony. Cole didn't fare better. He had been accused years ago of excessive force during a foot chase that landed a middle-aged man in the hospital with serious shoulder and head injuries. Although both avoided formal disciplinary action, the internal reports still documented these incidents, and within the department they were no secret. He didn't stop at telling their history. He questioned the very system that had allowed these accusations to fade away. When men like this are still handed guns and badges, the question isn't if something will happen again, it's when, he wrote. His words cut straight to the core of the public debate, forcing readers to confront a hard truth. What happened with Aisha wasn't an isolated case, but the direct result of a pattern of unchecked misconduct. The post spread rapidly, shared across dozens of forums and community groups, especially among those advocating for police reform. Thousands of comments poured in, most expressing outrage both at Mark and Cole's behavior and at the system that had allowed them to remain in uniform after previous incidents. Independent journalists quickly reached out to the post's author, requesting interviews and verification of the claims he made. One major news network even ran a short segment on the testimony of a former officer who once worked alongside the two policemen in the Aisha Kane case. The weight of the testimony lay not only in the information itself, but in how it was presented, clear, detailed, backed with examples, and grounded in enough technical knowledge to highlight highlight every procedural red flag. Many commenters said they trusted this post more than any official police statement because it came from someone who had been inside the system and understood how it really worked. Meanwhile, Mark and Cole remained completely silent, as if unable to issue a rebuttal without exposing more cracks in their own record. In the midst of this tension, the retired officer's post became a key piece of the larger puzzle. It not only strengthened public trust in Aisha Boot, also opened a new investigative path, forcing authorities to confront questions that had been ignored for years. On social media, one line from the post was shared more than any other, echoing like a warning. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about preventing them from repeating their mistakes before another innocent person pays the price. The post quickly expanded beyond small discussion group. Within hours, it had been shared tens of thousands of times, triggering a non-stop stream of comments. With each share came sharp commentary, some calling it a confession on behalf of an entire system, others saying, "This is the truth everyone needs to see." Independent news outlets began reposting the full text unedited to preserve its impact. Veteran journalists said they had never seen a personal account gain this level of influence so quickly. The public debate intensified by the hour, and this time the spotlight wasn't just on Aisha, it was squarely on Mark and Cole, with mounting questions about their pasts and how they had kept their badges through repeated accusations. Public pressure came crashing into police headquarters. Their official email inbox overflowed with thousands of messages demanding a response, and the hotline was flooded with calls from citizens and journalists alike. On forums, legal experts began dissecting department policies, pointing out that the police had full authority to suspend officers during an investigation, and that failure to do so could be seen as a cover-up. These legal analyses only fueled the outrage, propelling hashtags calling for Mark and Cole's suspension to the top of social media platforms. Under pressure like a storm bearing down, the police department's leadership held a closed-door meeting that lasted several hours. They knew that silence was no longer a safe strategy. Every minute without action was eroding their public image. One internal source told reporters that during the meeting, several leaders admitted, "This situation cannot be allowed to stand as evidence from the public mounted," and trust continued to unravel by the day. At last, a brief statement was posted on the police department's official page late in the afternoon. The wording was carefully chosen, avoiding any direct admission of wrongdoing while also not fully denying the external pressure. In the statement, they announced that they had made the decision to place officers Mark and Cole on temporary suspension pending the outcome of an internal investigation. That line spread instantly, nearly as fast as the original expose, becoming the new focal point of every conversation. Some viewed it as a temporary victory for public pressure, while many others warned that this was only the first step, and that continued vigilance would be needed to prevent the issue from being quietly buried. Outside police headquarters, the atmosphere immediately reflected the tension. Dozens of reporters gathered microphones and cameras pointed at the main entrance, waiting for any development. Peaceful protest groups held signs demanding transparency and justice for Aisha, their chants calling for a complete overhaul of the force. Online, many users posted the retired officer's statement alongside the suspension notice, as if to prove that public pressure could in fact force institutional response. Inside her apartment, Aisha quietly followed every update. News of the suspension flashed on her phone screen, accompanied by hundreds of messages from friends and supporters. She understood this wasn't the end, but it was a signal that what she had faced and resisted that day was now being seen by more people through a lens of fairness. And out there, the public outcry hadn't faded, suggesting that even bigger storms might be coming in the days ahead. A statement from the Veterans Organization released early that morning immediately triggered a wave across every platform. In the document, they declared that Aisha was not only a decorated former soldier, but a symbol of discipline and courage, qualities that all citizens deserve to have protected, not threatened. The message struck a chord with the public because it was no longer just a personal conflict between a woman and two officers. It had become a broad broader issue about how society treats those who have sacrificed for their country. Several TV networks invited representatives from the organization to speak, and every time an image of Aisha in uniform appeared, social media lit up with messages of support. Veterans from across the country shared the statement declaring they would not stand by while one of their own was smeared or mistreated. That collective energy quickly turned into action when, by that afternoon, thousands gathered at the city's central square for a peaceful march. The crowd stretched for hundreds of meters, and many holding signs calling for justice for Aisha, others waving the American flag or the Delta Force emblem in tribute to her service. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed on the pavement, accompanied by steady drum beats that added weight to the movement, not chaotic but powerful. Police were stationed to monitor the event, but the dominant atmosphere was unity and resolve, a sharp contrast to the tense confrontations the city had seen in the past. On both sides of the streets, residents joined the march, and many businesses temporarily closed so employees could participate. Handwritten signs hastily made, but full of emotion, were raised high as chants of justice for Aisha rang through the city. On social media, live videos from the march drew millions of views, propelling the image of a determined crowd to the top of trending feeds. Journalists noted it was one of the city's largest demonstrations in years, and what stood out was that it had not been organized by any political group, but had risen from the spontaneous force of the community itself. At the front of the march, a group of veterans led the way, hands gripping the unit's flag, eyes locked on the tie hall. Their presence gave the march a solemn gravity, with every step, from those who had faced war carrying a clear message to leadership. Justice could not be evaded. Speakers took turns addressing the crowd with brief, forceful remarks, reminding everyone that Aisha deserved protection and that this incident was a test of the entire legal system. From her apartment window, Aisha watched the live stream quietly, her emotions rising even as she maintained the calm focus of someone trained to lead in crisis. She knew this outpouring of support was powerful, but she also understood that the real battle lay ahead, where outcomes would depend not just on public outrage, but on every strategic move within the legal corridors still to come. Still, as Aisha looked at the flags flapping in the wind and the determined faces marching forward, she knew she was not alone, and that the overwhelming pressure from the community had become the greatest shield against any schemes yet to come. The email systems at City Hall and police headquarters were nearly paralyzed as hundreds more protest messages arrived by the minute. The messages came from across multiple states, not just from residents of the city, but also from human rights organizations, veterans groups, student associations, and individuals who had never met Aisha but felt outraged by what they had seen in the video. The tone of the emails varied. Some were short, with a single sentence like, "We demand justice," while others spanned several pages listing detailed evidence, citing legal codes, and calling for immediate action. Simultaneously, the government's hotline was overwhelmed by nonstop calls, each one firmly demanding the suspension and investigation of Mark and Cole. Many called from early morning to late at night, their voices calm but resolute, forcing phone operators to log and escalate each report. The public pressure quickly forced city officials to schedule an emergency meeting. Reports summarizing the volume of complaints, highlighted email excerpts, and call logs were laid out before the leadership board. No one in the room could ignore the massive scale of public response, especially as media outlets began to question why there had been no concrete action. Some council members feared that if they delayed any further, the peaceful protests could evolve into something more confrontational. The administration was now caught between preserving the department's image and answering the public's growing demand for transparency. The outcome of the meeting was a short but significant announcement. Mark and Cole would be summoned immediately to cooperate with an internal investigation. The decision was made public on the police department's official website and spread rapidly across the internet. Within minutes, Forums and social media exploded with mixed reactions. Supporters of Aisha saw it as a necessary move, though they remained cautious that the investigation must be fair and not reduced to a mere formality. Those defending the officers expressed frustration, viewing the decision as a capitulation to public pressure. As for Mark and Cole, receiving the summons happened under intense scrutiny. They arrived at headquarters visibly reluctant, avoiding the cameras waiting outside. No statements were made. No defense offered. They simply walked silently past a wall of reporters, shouting questions. Inside the interview room, investigators began taking statements, reviewing field footage, and cross-referencing related reports. Though still in its early stages, the process made clear that this case would not be quietly filed away like so many others before. The external pressure showed no signs of fading, and the public was watching closely to see whether the system would honor its claim that no one is above the law. The district attorney's office swiftly formed a special investigative team and ordered the technical unit to extract all footage from security cameras around the neighborhood where the incident took place. Screens in the analysis room lit up with multiple angles from the camera outside the convenience store to traffic cams on light poles to private security systems from nearby homes. Each video clip was reviewed frame by frame to pinpoint the exact time, location, and behavior of every individual present. Simultaneously, a witness came forward voluntarily offering a video recorded on a personal phone. This footage had never appeared on social media and clearly showed Cole firing the first shot, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of the gunshot and sharp breathing that followed. Investigators immediately entered the video into the forensic workflow, syncing its timestamp with camera data to eliminate doubts about its authenticity. They zoomed in on specific movements from the twitch in Cole's hand to Aisha's startled reaction as the bullet grazed her shoulder. An audio specialist was brought in to measure the exact interval between the two shots and confirmed that the first came from the officer's side. All of this evidence was compiled into a classified report sent directly to the prosecutor in charge of the case. The new footage wasn't disclosed to the public, but rumors began circulating within law enforcement circles. Some officers felt the pressure mount as they realized this evidence could upend the entire narrative Mark and Cole had tried to construct. The DA's office widened the investigation, summoning additional witnesses who had been present, even those who didn't record but could confirm the sequence of events. The inquiry now extended beyond the day of the incident, digging into both officers' service records and reviewing past complaints to detect patterns of abuse or misconduct. Inside the Special Investigation Team's briefing room, the atmosphere grew heavier with each new piece of evidence. Images, audio, and testimony were coming together to form a coherent timeline that starkly contradicted the police's initial report. The prosecutor concluded that if the investigation continued on this trajectory, there would be enough grounds to indict both officers not just for abuse of power, but for providing false statements during an official inquiry. Meanwhile, Aisha was invited in to give her formal statement, and this time, every word was carefully recorded with no one interrupting or steering her responses. Outside, public pressure continued to rise, but inside, those with legal authority were beginning to realize they could no longer turn away from the truth. Aisha's attorney stepped into the press conference room carrying a thick folder, his face stern and eyes sharp. He announced to dozens of reporters that the legal team had formally filed a request for the prosecution of Mark and Cole on charges of intentional assault, along with additional charges related to unlawful use of a firearm and serious breaches of professional conduct. He emphasized that this was not a case of self-defense or professional misjudgment. It was a deliberate attack fueled by prejudice and an abuse of power. As his words rang out, he placed the stack of evidence on the table, each document clearly numbered from scene photographs and ballistic reports to the consistent witness statements. Every piece was meticulously prepared, rendering the entire incident indisputable. The prosecutor reviewed the file immediately and recognized that this evidence not only strengthened the case, but also gave Aisha a clear strategic advantage. The video, capturing the exact moment Cole pulled the trigger first, the forensic report confirming the bullet trajectory, and the audio analysis verifying the timing between the two shots, all aligned perfectly with the defensive reaction. Additionally, the personnel records for Mark and Cole revealed multiple past complaints of misconduct, some of which had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence now resurfacing to support the argument that this was part of a broader systemic pattern. Public pressure escalated as national news outlets moved the story to front-page coverage, analyzing each piece of evidence released by Aisha's legal team. Legal experts invited on television segments unanimously agreed that with the current case file, Aisha stood a strong chance of winning in court. This forced the police department into total silence, with every statement tightly controlled to avoid further damage. Even some who had defended Mark and Cole began to waver, watching the evidence stack like hammer blows, sealing off any escape route for them. In subsequent meetings, Aisha's attorney fully leveraged the momentum, repeatedly requesting that the investigation expand to include similar past incidents involving Mark and Cole, while also filing motions for witness protection to prevent intimidation or interference. Every move was calculated to apply legal pressure while keeping Aisha's story alive in the public eye. Her and the legal team's unwavering stance not only pushed the case closer to justice, but also forced many who had dismissed it as an isolated event to re-examine the entire framework of power and accountability within law enforcement. Aisha's resolve, backed by undeniable facts and a strategic legal push, began reshaping the conversation from one about a street altercation to one confronting a system long overdue for scrutiny. Since the investigation file was made public, the wave of attention has gone beyond the state's borders. The Federal Department of Justice officially sent a letter requiring the local police department to submit a detailed report of the entire course of events, along with full transcripts, security camera data, and all disciplinary records related to Mark and Cole throughout their service. This request was marked urgent, and the response deadline was only a matter of days, forcing those who had delayed or tried to obscure the truth to act immediately. The Department of Justice's involvement was a clear signal that this was no longer a community dispute, but had become a national issue. Meanwhile, in Washington, many federal politicians spoke out. A senator well known for his stance on police reform posted on social media, "Protecting justice cannot rely on luck. It must be guaranteed through action and transparency. The Aisha Kane case is a test." The post quickly drew hundreds of thousands of interactions, prompting more influential figures to join the debate. Some members of Congress even sent an open letter to the state governor calling for an independent investigation to ensure objectivity and proposing the creation of a special oversight committee. Pressure from both public opinion and politics pushed the police department into a state of extreme tension. Many senior officers realized that without proactively cooperating and making the investigation prestigious as transparent, they risked being accused of concealing information, which could lead to severe consequences for the entire agency. Some who had remained silent began considering testifying to protect their positions and reputation. This shift in attitude did not stem from goodwill, but from the heavy weight of political pressure bearing down day after day. Aisha, once a victim, had now become the center of a national conversation about about the responsibilities and powers of law enforcement. She received invitations to join online forums with lawmakers, former officials, and legal experts to share her perspective, affirming that justice was not only about holding two individuals accountable, but also about changing the system that allowed them to act that way. Each time she spoke, social media erupted, creating a cycle that made the case increasingly difficult to bury. This climate left the police department with no way to retreat. For once, the Department of Justice and federal politicians were involved. Any sign of delay or evasion would be scrutinized in every detail. The political temperature rose by the day, and with each new development, the path toward the trial of Mark and Cole seemed to be widening faster and sharper than ever. Inside the department, the already tense atmosphere began to crack further as outside pressures mounted. Some veteran officers, long opposed to the leadership's handling of the case, suddenly submitted resignations as a form of protest. They believed that shielding Mark and Cole not only damaged the reputation of the entire force, but also caused the community's trust in the police to collapse faster than any previous crisis. Resignation letters appeared in succession within a few days, accompanied by candid statements that they did not want to be part of an organization driven by fear and calculated silence. Some left quietly, but others chose to make their reasons public, drawing even more media attention and fueling the heated debate. In contrast to the upheaval outside, Aisha chose to keep an absolute silence. She declined all interview requests, avoided appearing at any public event, and made no comments on social media. To her, this was not the time for argument or heightened emotion, but for focusing entirely on the ongoing legal process. Her silence sparked curiosity, yet it also created a vacuum in which speculation about her grew stronger. Some viewed it as a wise strategy, as the fewer the words, the more the weight of evidence and concrete action stood out. Outside, public opinion kept buzzing with sides clearly divided. Supporters believed Aisha was on the right path, staying clear of media traps and letting matters be resolved within the bounds of the law. Opponents tried to portray her as avoiding scrutiny, though such claims were often countered by the evidence and testimony already made public. In that climate, Aisha's quietness did not cool the case, but instead kept it in the spotlight like a smoldering ember waiting to flare into a large fire at the upcoming trial. The next hearing grew heavy the moment the attorney representing Mark and Cole rose to speak. He tried to construct an alternate scenario, claiming that the two officers thought Aisha had drawn her gun first and that their actions were merely defensive. His tone was dry yet tinged with reluctance, as if even he did not fully believe what he was saying. Around the room, many eyes turned toward the prosecution's table, where Aisha's team maintained absolute composure. As soon as the defense finished, the prosecution played a counter video recorded by a security camera from another angle of the street. The footage was sharp, the audio clear, showing Cole firing the first shot, while Aisha stood empty-handed beside her friend, making no move to draw a weapon. The air in the courtroom seemed to compress as each frame dismantled the story the police attorneys had tried to build. A few spectators gasped and others shook their heads in disappointment. Mark and Cole's defense team faltered, requesting a pause to review the evidence, but the prosecutor only gave a cold smile, reminding the court that all data had been verified by an independent forensics agency. Pressure mounted on the two defendants, their once confident expressions now rigid eyes avoiding the press cameras. Aisha herself sat still, hands clasped on the table, her gaze steady and calm. She did not need to speak, for each second of the footage was enough to shake the fragile shield the opposing side had built. The gap between the defense's claims and reality was so stark that many in the gallery began whispering this was no longer a legal debate, but a public collapse. When the video ended, the judge's gavel struck, confirming the evidence would be entered into the official record, and the police's already weakened defensive wall all but crumbled. Once the counter video was widely shared, social media erupted in fierce outrage. Forums, independent news sites, and local community groups all labeled Mark and Cole liars, posting screenshots from the hearing to illustrate the contrast between their statements and the truth. Many posts dissected each frame in detail, pointing out the moment Cole fired before Aisha made any move, turning the two officers into the focal point of condemnation. New hashtags emerged rapidly, demanding not only justice for Aisha, but also criminal accountability for their deceit. The tension spilled over into major news outlets. Evening commentary shows invited legal experts to analyze the case, many emphasizing that false testimony by police in a shooting incident was a particularly grave offense sufficient to constitute perjury and obstruction of justice. Interviews with local residents revealed trust in the police in the area had sunk to its lowest point in years, with many openly stating they no longer felt safe encountering a patrol officer. Legal pressure began to mount quickly as the prosecutor's office opened a new line of investigation focused on allegations of deceit and the concealment of evidence. Independent lawyers and human rights organizations sent a series of letters urging the Department of Justice to closely monitor the case, ensuring all procedures were carried out transparently and without exception for anyone. Peaceful protests continued daily outside police headquarters each time, drawing a growing number of participants carrying banners that read, "No tolerance for lies and justice has no exceptions." Mark and Cole were rarely seen in public, appearing only when leaving court under heavy protection. Those images further ignited public anger, with crowds shouting and calling them harsh names. Observers noted that under the current circumstances, the likelihood of the two escaping serious charges was very low, as both public opinion and the legal system were under pressure to deliver a verdict strong enough to serve as a deterrent. Amid it all, Aisha remained silent, letting the evidence and the weight of truth answer every feeble defense from the opposing side. The City Council announced it would hold a public hearing broadcast live for all residents to follow. From early morning, the square in front of the Tie Hall was packed, many carrying signs in support of Aisha, others holding up phones ready to capture every moment. Inside the chamber, lights shone on the long row where council members sat with stern expressions. Local and national media set up cameras and reporters took notes non-stop. When Aisha entered, the atmosphere settled, whispers faded, and every eye turned toward her. Aisha stood tall, her gaze calm yet unyielding, clear voice carrying through the microphone. She began by recounting the entire sequence of events that day, from chatting with a friend on the street to the moment the patrol car suddenly pulled up. She described in detail Mark's contemptuous look, the biting tone as he ordered her off the sidewalk as if it were not a place for someone like her. Reaching the moment, Cole raised his gun. Aisha paused, then spoke slowly, each word deliberate. What I saw in his eyes was not the alertness of an officer on duty, but resentment and hatred. She went on to recount the racial slurs uttered before the bullet grazed her shoulder, and how her body, trained through hundreds of hours of combat practice, reacted instinctively to survive. Aisha stressed that this was not simply a confrontation between a citizen and police, but proof of the danger when power rests in the hands of those with prejudice willing to use violence to impose it. Every part of her account came with details of Soundslight and the sting and pain at the wound, holding the room in complete silence. A few council members asked her to clarify the timing and context of the slurs. Aisha answered precisely, without evasion, emphasizing that videos from multiple witnesses had recorded everything. Each time a clip played on the large screen, murmurs spread through the room, some shaking their heads in outrage. Outside, thousands followed on the live broadcast in the square, clapping or chanting each time Aisha delivered a sharp response. When her testimony ended, the air in the room remained thick. Some reporters hurried off to file breaking stories, while Council members exchanged glances, clearly aware of the weight of what they had heard. The hearing not only exposed the threats and racial abuse from Mark and Cole, but also turned Aisha's story into a symbol for thousands of similar incidents long hidden or distorted. From that moment, it was clear this would not be a case allowed to fade into silence. Thunderous applause filled the chamber as Aisha finished her testimony, quickly turning into chants of support. Some stood raising signs with her name slogans like "Justice for Aisha" and "End Abuse of Power" swaying in rhythm with the crowd's calls. The atmosphere was electric, yet united, spreading from the front rows to the doorway. The sound blended with the tapping of pens from a few council members like a drumbeat signaling change. Even those who had come only to observe were swept up in the wave of emotion, their eyes brighter, their expressions released from the gloom of many tense days. Amid the cheers, Mark and Cole sat in the seats reserved for those under question in their posture, hunched eyes avoiding the cameras. They no longer wore the defiant look seen in previous appearances, replaced instead by small, uneasy movements. Mark bent his head slightly shoulder-side, drawn-in fingers interlaced on his lap. Cole glanced down at the floor as if searching for a fixed point to hold on to, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Each time the crowd shouted, they seemed to shrink, further tension flickering across their faces. Reporters along the side rows quickly captured these moments, lenses sweeping to record the image of two men who once faced situations with arrogant force, now retreating as if overwhelmed. The live broadcast screens instantly displayed the stark contrast on one side, Aisha standing firm, her steady voice still resonating. On the other, two officers bowed under the weight of a defiant atmosphere. Outside City Hall, the cheers from the crowd watching on a massive screen echoed, blending with the sound inside, creating an invisible pressure that deepened the heaviness for Mark and Cole. That moment was just part of the hearing, but a symbol of a reversed balance of power, from those who once controlled the situation to facing a public spotlight fixed on their every action and word. The image, though, left unanalyzed in the room, was understood by all to mark a pivotal turning point in the entire course of the case. When the city council chair finished announcing the voting results, the room seemed to erupt. The initial murmur of voices was instantly drowned out by a wave of cheers. The yes votes held an overwhelming majority, and the decision to detain Mark and Cole pending formal trial passed without a single substantial objection. The council members exchanged glances in a tense silence, then each nodded as if sharing the conviction that they had just set an important milestone in the city's administrative history. That instant, brief and taut, like a drawn string, was shattered by an explosion of applause, followed by whistles, shouts, and even muffled sobs from the audience. Not only inside the chamber, but also outside, through the thick glass, came the sound of drums echoing and chants crashing in waves against the building's brick walls. The square was jammed with people holding high signs reading "Justice for Aisha, no one above the law, and we're watching." These slogans were no longer mere calls to action, firm declarations amplified through hundreds of portable speakers stirring a city that had been subdued in recent days. Some wept upon hearing the result, not from joy alone, but from the feeling of witnessing justice in motion after years of doubt. The crowd surged onto social media like a storm. Images from the chamber, live stream videos, and especially the expressions on Mark and Cole's faces as they heard the decision spread rapidly. The hashtag #JusticeForAisha quickly rose to the top of trending lists on multiple platforms. Independent journalists, social activists, and ordinary users poured in to comment, share, and even edit clips to highlight Aisha's unyielding expression throughout the meeting. Streaming platforms nearly crashed for several minutes due to the massive influx of viewers. International media began to take notice with headlines such as "Small City Big Echo" and "A Rare Victory for Citizens Against Abusive Power." Inside, Mark and Cole were ordered to stand, their faces turned pale and stiff like wax figures stripped of the authority that had once made many in the city bow in fear. 2 security officers closed in, handcuffing them in full view of the crowd. Cameras missed no detail from the click of the cold metal locking to their walk down the aisle between 2 rows of glaring onlookers. Shouts rang out accompanied by blunt condemnations. There was no leniency left for them, no sympathetic glance. All that remained was disdain and a surge of long-suppressed hunger for justice, now unleashed for all to see. National television networks immediately cut their programming to broadcast the moment live. On-air commentators could not hide their astonishment and excitement. Headlines began appearing, "Victory for Justice, Aisha no longer alone," a warning to those above the law. In less than an hour, numerous articles were published analyzing the impact of this event on the judicial system, the local government, and public awareness. Many legal experts were hastily invited for interviews offering assessments of the meeting and its accompanying political consequences. Aisha sat quietly in the back row, surrounded by the noise yet existent in her own separate space, completely detached from the sounds around her. She did not smile, but her eyes shone with a bright, steady resolve. Months of struggle, of rejection, doubt, and distortion had converged into a single, real moment. She did not break down or weep, but kept an unusual clarity. She knew this was only the beginning. The trial ahead still waited, the fight was not over, and the perpetrator had not yet faced the ultimate punishment. But at the very least, justice now had a voice loud enough to make the powerful bow their heads. She rose, holding the worn folder she had carried countless times, walking slowly yet firmly toward the door. Chairs scraped against the floor, applause swelled again like a surging tide. People in the room stood with her as if sending off a hero leaving the battlefield. With every step she took, she felt the gaze of each person, some filled with gratitude, some with admiration, some quiet, like a silent promise to stand by her. When her hand touched the large wooden door, a strong gust rushed in, carrying with it the clamor from outside, drums, chants, singing, sobs, all echoing back like a wave of pressure, making her close her eyes briefly to steady herself. The moment she stepped out of the building, she was met by a wall of people. Reporters, photographers, cameramen, independent journalists, and citizens live streaming on their phones. Camera flashes flickered without pause. Microphones were thrust toward her face, jostling for space without the slightest gap. "Aisha, how do you feel right now? Do you think the upcoming trial will be fair? Are you planning a civil lawsuit?" Questions fired like rapid gunshots, relentless. Everyone hoped to capture a moment or a quote worthy of a headline. Aisha did not respond, offering no unnecessary expression. She maintained an almost unbelievable calm, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. Quickly, she recognized several familiar faces, reporters who had once misrepresented her, deliberately splicing her words to serve personal or partisan agendas. They, too, were here, crowding in like opportunists, feeding on a victory they had once denied. Aisha did not stop to confront them, needing no rebuttal. She simply kept walking, her back straight and her pace steady, delivering a silent message stronger than any spoken declaration. 2 security officers immediately stepped forward, pulling her from the press of bodies. They cleared a path through a corridor packed with people, accompanying her to the steps leading out to the square in front of the courthouse. There, hundreds of citizens were waiting. When they saw her, they raised their signs in unison, shouted her name, and some lifted their hands high as if welcoming a general returning from battle. The air seemed to thicken with emotion, excitement, and the swelling sentiment of the crowd. An elderly person wiped away tears, a child perched on a father's shoulders to better see the courageous woman. Aisha gave only a slight nod. A faint smile flickered across her lips, just enough for every camera to catch it, just enough to ignite the crowd's excitement. Though her heart was still heavy with worry for the road ahead, she knew one thing with certainty. From this moment on, she would no longer stand alone. She stepped out of the chamber, not as as a victim seeking pity, but as a living emblem of resolve and faith in the truth. She was proof that with enough pressure and enough voices, even the most rigid and sluggish system could be moved toward justice. And, in the golden light of a day filled with upheaval, the image of Aisha, descending the courthouse steps surrounded by unending cheers, became an indelible exclamation point in the city's memory. Only a few hours after Aisha left the courthouse, before the atmosphere around the city had time to settle, another intense wave began to surge, not on the streets but across the ceaseless flow of social media feeds. From Facebook and Twitter to local forums, posts began to appear in large numbers, many from people who had once chosen to remain silent. They were people of color, immigrants, veterans, those who had lived in the shadows of suspicion, watched by the system without leaving evidence clear enough to resist. Teenagers once stopped in the street simply for wearing a cap backward, for failing to lower their gaze when called, or for the simple reason of not looking trustworthy, now saw for the first time that their own stories carried weight when placed alongside Aisha's. Under hashtags like #Justice with Aisha to speak your truth and #Enough is enough, thousands of accounts poured out like a dam long blocked finally breaking. A middle-aged woman told of being stopped by two officers in the middle of an intersection while taking her child to the doctor. They made her pull over, questioned her, then tore through every compartment of her car under the pretext of a safety check as the child coughed hoarsely in the back seat. A veteran shared an old video showing him being shoved onto a sidewalk by three officers simply for matching a suspect's description while he had just attended a memorial for fellow soldiers and was still in uniform. The stories were no longer isolated. Each line, each detail, each image linked together into a network of evidence of abuse embedded deep within the structure of law enforcement. Social media turned into a living archive, a public court where every piece of evidence was presented without permission, without censorship, beyond anyone's ability to ignore. Videos, once removed from mainstream platforms, were reposted with dates, coordinates, and witness statements. Recordings of emergency calls in which a child's cries could be heard as a father was wrongfully detained, photographs of bizarre citations issued for uncooperative attitude when asking for direction. All of it poured and shared hundreds of thousands of times. Several major influencer accounts joined in. They not only reposted stories, but also analyzed, cross-referenced, and built online maps to highlight areas with high frequencies of abuse. Charts revealed clusters of red dots near schools in low-income neighborhoods by bus stops, places where power could easily turn into a weapon. Human rights groups compiled the data, began calling for independent investigations, sent open letters to authorities, and urged community inspections. But there was more than outrage in these posts. There was also release. Speaking out seemed to be the first act in dismantling the burden of suppression, reclaiming ownership of one's own story. Many admitted they had never considered speaking out, thinking it was too small or believing no one would believe me, but Aisha, her resolve, courage, and initial victory had opened a path. A young man in another state wrote that 3 years ago, police had pressed a gun to his head simply for riding his bike into a neighborhood of a different skin color. The memory had made him withdrawn, unwilling to tell anyone or trust anyone. But after following Aisha's journey, he posted the full account for the first time along with photos of the citation and his psychological evaluation. Within hours, he received hundreds of encouraging messages and an offer of legal assistance from a group of volunteer attorneys. This eruption did not remain local. International media began reporting. News channels from Europe, Asia, and South America quoted the case, placing it within the global context of injustice and discrimination. Posts in Spanish, French, Japanese, and more appeared translating Aisha's speeches, sharing courtroom clips, and calling for similar action in their own countries. Social media was no longer just a place to spread news. It had become an organizing tool, a massive court of public opinion, where voices once stifled stifled, now thundered against walls built of power and silence. In the days that followed, Aisha had barely a moment of quiet. Her phone buzzed constantly, her inbox overflowed with interview requests, collaboration offers, letters of thanks, truth-telling accounts, and veiled threats. She read every line, sorted and archived them, kept the stories that mattered, and forwarded urgent cases to the legal support team. Yet deep inside, Aisha knew she had to do something bigger. After many nights of thought and conversations with advisors, she accepted an invitation from an international human rights organization to be the keynote speaker at its annual conference in Washington, D.C. The day she received the confirmation letter, she sat alone in her small room. No noise, no lights, only a white envelope and her hand trembling slightly as the weight of responsibility began to settle on her shoulders. She knew that from the moment she stepped onto that stage, her words would no longer belong to her alone. They would belong to thousands who had once been silent, stripped of their voice. The conference hall was vast, with a high ceiling and white light pouring down on each row of seats like the gaze of the world. Hundreds sat below activists, lawyers, scholars, and those once oppressed who were now reclaiming themselves. When Aisha's name was announced, applause roared like a waterfall. Not because she was famous, but because she embodied something everyone longed for, truth spoken aloud. She walked onto the stage not as a victim, but as a survivor. Her eyes did not seek pity. They sought awakening. She began, not with ornate words, but with her own story, direct, unembellished, unflinching. She spoke of that fateful night of the flashlight beam aimed straight into her eyes, of the voice cold as steel, ordering her to lie on the ground, of the way passers-by turned their gaze away out of fear of being involved. She told it not to stir emotion, but to underline the absurdity of a system that allows such things to exist in a society presumed to be just. When she finished, the hall was silent for a few seconds before erupting into a prolonged round of applause. After the speech, dozens waited for her outside, not to ask for photos, but to thank her, to tell her their own stories, to ask how to begin. From that conference, Aisha entered a new phase, becoming the voice for a broad movement. She continued to appear at forums of all sizes, from a judicial reform conference in New York, where she spoke directly with legislators, to university panel discussions where students erupted in applause when she said justice should not be a privilege, it is a standard. In every place she listened more than she spoke, noting down every story, every person. After each speech, Aisha always set aside time to meet privately with those who came to share. Some placed a letter in her hand, some simply stood in silence and nodded, some broke into tears the moment they spoke. She promised nothing except to listen, but for many that was enough. Aisha's story was no longer a personal case. It had become a symbol. Images of her on stage eyes, steadfast voice resolute, were printed on posters, quoted in speeches, and spread across platforms. Every step she took, every word she spoke was another brick on the road. Millions were building together a road leading to a society where justice is not a distant destination, but an obvious fact of life. At the annual conference of the Veterans Association, where those who once carried arms across battlefields ranging from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East gathered, the atmosphere always bore the solemn color of the past and the resilience of the present. The hall was wide, with high ceilings and white lights shining down on rows of seats upholstered in deep blue. On stage, the American flag swayed gently beside the emblem of each branch of Service, Marine Corps, Air Force, Navy, Army. Some veterans wore full ceremonial uniforms, shoulders straight, chests covered with medals. Others dressed simply, shirts, slacks, worn leather shoes, but their eyes were the same sharp, seasoned, and not easily moved. When the host announced Aisha's name, there was a brief moment of silence, not out of doubt, but out of respect. In that solemn space, Aisha walked onto the stage without haste, without raising her hand in greeting, and without a wide smile. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. Yet her eyes carried a weight not easily named, a weight only those who have witnessed and lived through crisis can understand. The eyes of someone who does not tell a story to be heard, but tells it so the listener can no longer turn away. She began not with formal words of thanks, but by connecting with the audience in a simple, effective way. I have never carried a gun into battle, but I know exactly what it feels like to be attacked without warning, to have only seconds to react in order to stay alive, and above all, to carry a memory no one else can bear for you. The people in the audience said nothing, but their posture shifted, more serious, more focused. A few nodded lightly, others put pen to notebook. Aisha recounted not in the sequence of events, but in the sequence of feelings. She led the listeners into a specific moment. The blinding glare of a flashlight aimed straight into her eyes, the threatening voice giving orders, the metallic smell from her collar, damp with cold sweat, the feel of the ground beneath her cheekies, cold even in the middle of summer. The small details, seemingly trivial, were presented by Aisha with a cold precision never exaggerated for drama. Each sentence, each image allowed the audience to picture the absolute helplessness she endured, not because she was weak, but because in that moment power rested in someone else's hands and they used it the wrong way. However, Aisha did not stop at memory. She shifted from her own story to social reality. She stressed, "Not everyone gets the chance to stand here and tell it." Then she continued about those who were never recorded, who had no witnesses, who had no time to turn on a camera. Victims struck down not for lack of will, but for lack of proof. We are living in an era where the truth can be buried under 10 official reports. Without clear evidence, the voice of the harmed becomes nothing more than an unfounded account. The hall was now almost silent. Many leaned forward in their seats, focusing on every word, every point. A young veteran placed his hand over his chest, an older one tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden table, each reacting in their own way, yet all toward one thing. They were listening not just to a witness, but to someone turning lived experience into strategic lessons. Aisha went on to speak about preparation. She listed specifics from carrying a recording device using an automatic cloud storage app to sharing information with trusted relatives, never letting any data exist on only one device. She spoke about the support system she had built with the help of several volunteer groups where all evidence was encrypted, stored, and verified by a third party. This isn't just a reaction. This is a survival strategy. If I hadn't had that clip, if I hadn't had the voices of those standing nearby, I wouldn't be here. She moved to another example, a veteran named Marvin who had fought in Iraq, returned home, and was wrongly arrested because he shared a name with a suspect. Marvin had no video, no one to record the moment he was pushed into a police car while walking to buy milk for his child. When he tried to resist, the official record said resisting arrest. It took 6 months for Marvin to be cleared, but the stain on his record could never be completely erased. Aisha quoted Marvin's words, "I could survive a war, but I never thought I'd be broken in the very place I call home." Marvin's story brought the room down. Aisha paused for a few seconds, then continued, "Every piece of evidence you keep is not only self-defense. It's part of the shared wall we're building, so the next generation doesn't have to fight the same enemy on the same front." By this point, the atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. From listening, people had shifted into action. Some raised their hands to ask for paper to write, and a few began exchanging quick words with their neighbors. In the front row, a group of former officers who had served in Africa were noting down every suggestion Aisha gave, nodding repeatedly. They understood that the times had changed. The battlefield today might not have guns, but people still fall. Power is still abused, and their duty as those who once swore to protect justice has never ended. At the end of her speech, Aisha stood still, stepping back slightly, as if to take in the whole room more clearly. Her voice was deliberate. "You may have left the military, but the warrior spirit does not live in the uniform. It lives in how we protect the truth even when no one asks us to." She looked toward the row of the eldest attendees, white-haired, deep-eyed, and gave a slight nod. And today our weapons are transparency, evidence, data, images that cannot be denied. The applause rose like a slow but powerful wave, starting from the rows nearest the stage and spreading through the entire hall. It was not loud or showy, but steady and deep like an unspoken pledge. Some saluted in the military way, their movements sharp. Others stood upright after minutes of sitting still, their eyes lit with awakening. Aisha did not shed tears, did not overplay her expression, but her eyes shone more clearly now, carrying the certainty that she had done the right thing. Not because the audience applauded, but because they understood. After Aisha left the stage, she did not leave right away. Many people approached orderly, yet with urgency. They wanted to share, to say they had been in that position on the other side of power, and sometimes its victims. Some handed her business cards offering support for secure information storage technology. Others simply stood still, placed a hand on her shoulder for a second, then quietly walked away. Every action, however small, carried a message larger than words. While people were still engaged in lively discussions, a group of officials from various agencies seated on the right side of the hall began exchanging brief remarks. One of them, a representative from the Public Safety Oversight Committee, stepped to the organizers' table, spoke quickly with an aide, then walked into the aisle and shook Aisha's hand in front of hundreds. He said simply, "We want to include this content in mandatory training for newly recruited police officers." A brief silence followed, then voices of agreement rose. Aisha did not rush to respond. She looked each person in the group in the eye, then said, "If it helps them understand that power must come with responsibility, I'm ready to cooperate." Her answer was not blind approval, but a conditional affirmation that she was not giving away her story to paint emotions, but to warn, to educate, to bring change. Several proposed on the spot to create a training package containing videos, testimonies, legal analysis, and simulated scenarios to prepare law enforcement to handle situations involving discrimination correctly. The conference ended, but its resonance did not fade. Those who left the hall that day carried more than a speech. They carried a new frame of reference on how to see the truth, the value of preparedness, and the collective power when individual memories are linked into a chain of warnings for the future. Aisha, in her calm, had sparked this not as an inspirational speaker, but as a warrior of a new era fighting with evidence and truth. The documentary began filming just a few weeks after the Veterans Conference, when the producers recognized the powerful draw of Aisha's story. They sought out each witness, dug through every video clip, and reconstructed the chain of events with vivid imagery, bringing viewers back to each tense moment every second when justice seemed suffocated. The footage of Aisha, surrounded by supporters, her calm gaze when facing false accusations, and her steady voice before the camera were all woven into a coherent whole. The film did more than reconstruct the truth. It broadened the perspective, interviewing legal experts, social activists, and even former police officers to show that this was not an isolated event, but a slice of a deeper systemic problem. When the film aired on major streaming platforms and television networks, it quickly drew millions of views, accompanied by thousands of comments expressing empathy, outrage, and determination to act. Many wrote that they understood for the first time the importance of recording evidence and felt compelled to join efforts to protect justice in their own communities. The film went beyond stirring emotion, calling for concrete action, signing petitions, attending community meetings, and demanding transparency from law enforcement agencies. The reach of the film led many law schools, research institutes, and police training organizations to take an interest in incorporating Aisha's story into their official curriculum. Soon, the Federal Criminal Law Textbook Committee contacted contacted her, requesting to use the entire case as a study in their training program. The process took many months, with legal experts analyzing each detail of the case, from the initial encounter to the actions of each party to the subsequent legal developments. In the textbook, Aisha's case was presented not only as evidence of abuse of power and society's response, but also accompanied by discussion questions, evidence analysis exercises, and comparisons to similar precedents from the past. This allowed law students to move beyond dry theory and understand the real-world impact of legal provisions on everyday life. In many classrooms, when the discussion portion began, students often split into two groups: one arguing in defense of the police to test legal reasoning, and the other siding with Aisha to defend individual rights and justice. These debates made the atmosphere lively, while helping students realize that, in reality, justice does not exist on its own. It must be built and protected through every small act, every voice raised at the right time. Aisha received the first printed copy of the textbook, with her name listed among notable cases, and the feeling was both strange and deeply meaningful. The story she once thought would remain only a painful memory had now become part of shared knowledge, a tool for teaching and learning about truth. When the documentary and the textbook were released widely at the same time, the combined impact pushed Aisha's story beyond the scope of a single legal case to become a symbol of reform. Many national conferences invited her as a keynote speaker, not only to recount what she had been through, but to discuss long-term solutions for reducing abuses of power and building trust between communities and law enforcement. On online forums, people from distant states continued to mention her name, sharing film excerpts and passages from the book as materials for training community workers or organizing talks at schools. International human rights organizations also took notice, inviting Aisha to overseas conferences to share her experience, showing that the issues she faced were not confined to one country, but were a global challenge. Each time she stood before a new audience, she carried the belief that the strength of the story was not in how shocking it was, but in its ability to inspire and drive tangible change, even after the media spotlight had faded. And somewhere, young police officers, newly graduated law students, or ordinary citizens were reading, watching, and listening, so that one day, when faced with a choice between power and justice, they would act differently. Aisha was officially invited to be the face of a nationwide police reform campaign, a role that was both symbolic and demanding of constant dedication. The organizers recognized that the image of a woman who had once served in Delta Force, standing resilient after suffering abuse of power, was the most vivid embodiment of their message. The law must serve people, not shield wrongful authority. Since taking on this role, Aisha appeared frequently on forums and campaign videos and at community events, large and small. Her gaze no longer carried only the guarded watchfulness of the past, but also a steady determination and a clear belief in the power of change. Each time she stepped onto a stage, whether in a packed auditorium or an open-air park, she began by reminding people that reform could not remain a slogan. It needed concrete action, from revising regulations and improving training to encouraging transparency in all law enforcement activities. The campaign quickly drew widespread attention because Aisha did not speak like a politician or a career activist, but from real-life experience, from moments when she had faced danger to protect her own life. The media portrayed her as the emblem of a new generation unafraid to demand change, while many local communities began organizing discussions using her story as an entry point for their own reform plans. Aisha's public presence was not only political or media-oriented, but also sparked a deep wave of personal connection. She received hundreds of letters, emails, and messages from everywhere, from remote small towns to major cities. Some letters were written in the trembling handwriting of elderly people, recounting the haunting memories of being stopped without cause and the helplessness they felt in the face of abuse of power. Some came in short notes from teenagers, saying her story had given them the courage to speak out against wrongdoing they had once chosen to ignore. A few letters came from police officers themselves admitting they had once believed in harmful biases, but after learning about Aisha's case had begun to question how they treated the community. Most moving to Aisha were the letters from families who had lost loved ones in similar incidents, seeing her as the shared voice of those who could not speak. Each letter was not only a thank you, but also a message entrusted to her, a reminder that the path she was walking was not just for herself, but for thousands of others. On quiet evenings, Aisha often opened her mailbox, randomly chose a few letters to read, and it was those honest words that helped her sustain her resolve, despite the significant pressure from both supporters and critics. At the same time, the reform campaign Aisha represented began to achieve tangible progress, further strengthening the faith of those who had sent her their gratitude. Some states passed new regulations requiring the recording of all interactions between police and civilians, expanding independent oversight mechanisms, and establishing hotlines to report abuses of power. Whenever news of a reform broke, the campaign organizers shared it widely and reminded everyone that it was the result of community pressure, of each voice and each action. Despite her constant travel schedule, Aisha made time to respond to certain letters, not only to express her appreciation, but also to encourage the writers to stay involved and lead efforts in their own communities. She understood that the campaign's success did not lie in her standing alone as a symbol, but in thousands of people becoming the driving force for change together. From a personal story full of trials, Aisha had stepped into the role of connector, motivator, and spark for community awareness, a journey in which every thank you letter, every handshake in person, and every brief conversation on the sidelines of an event helped build collective strength. The final verdict was delivered on a gray morning, the courtroom packed to capacity. As the judge read each word clearly, the air was so thick that even the sound of breathing seemed louder. Mark and Cole, once standing in a position of dominance, now bowed their heads as they listened to the sentence of prison time with no leniency. In the gallery, many eyes lit up with a sense of release after months of tension. In another corner, a few of their former victims held hands tightly, as if this ruling was not only for Aisha, but for all who had endured in silence. Outside the courthouse, hundreds stood under light rain, holding signs with words about justice and truth, quietly waiting for the moment when cheers could erupt as the doors opened. Not everyone had believed the system could deliver a fair sentence, but today they had seen it happen at least once, and it was enough to rekindle trust long worn away. The trial's outcome also marked a turning point for the local police department. Immediately after the verdict, the department received a mandate from higher authorities and the Department of Justice to carry out a full-scale reform. An independent oversight committee was formed consisting of legal experts, community representatives, former officers, and human rights advocates to monitor every step of implementation. Retraining sessions were organized not only to reinforce procedural protocols, but also to focus on human rights awareness, public duty, and transparency. Body cameras became mandatory on every shift, with footage to be stored and available for independent investigation when needed. The atmosphere within the department shifted noticeably, with some veteran officers openly admitting that Aisha's case was a wake-up call, forcing them to reconsider how they exercised authority and treated the public. The reform process was not smooth, but the constant watch of the community ensured it could not be quietly set aside. For Aisha, the day the verdict was delivered and the reform measures announced brought a feeling both lightened and heavy. She knew that even though Mark and Cole were held accountable, many like them still existed somewhere within the system. Yet, at the very least, steps toward change had been set in motion, and the combined force of public pressure and community unity had proven that justice was not just a theory. As she left the courthouse, Aisha did not walk quickly, letting each step register the cold tiles beneath her feet as a way of marking this historic moment. Outside, the crowd waited, not shouting, but raising their fists in unison, forming a sea of people unified in silence. It was not the silence silence of fear, but the silence of strength of belief that once the truth is revealed, it will spread and force even the most powerful forces to bow. Aisha smiled, not because she had won for herself, but because she knew she had helped ensure that future generations would walk a path with fewer shadows. The Victims of Police Violence Support Fund was announced at a warm yet weighty press conference attended by numerous social organizations, human rights lawyers, and individuals who had experienced injustice. The fund's goal was not only to provide immediate financial aid to affected victims, but also to offer legal services, psychological counseling, and help them regain stability in their lives. From past incidents that had shaken public opinion, people understood that the impact of violence and abuse of power did not end with physical wounds, but extended into lasting psychological trauma, economic loss, and the collapse of trust. For that reason, the creation of the fund was not merely an act of goodwill, but a long-term strategy to protect communities from falling into a cycle of silence and helplessness. News of the fund spread quickly, and philanthropists, nonprofit organizations, and individuals who had followed Aisha's story sent the first contributions, turning the idea into a living entity from its very first day. Aisha took on the role of advisor to the fund with a dedication few could match. Her combat experience in the military, the bitter reality of facing violence from those sworn to protect, and her unwavering pursuit of justice made her irreplaceable in shaping its operation. Aisha not only proposed support mechanisms, but also directly participated in reviewing applications, ensuring the fund prioritized urgent and truly necessary cases. She actively met with victims, listened to their stories to determine the most effective form of assistance, and encouraged them to share their experiences to raise public awareness. Aisha's presence was not just symbolic, but gave tangible reassurance to those in despair. They saw in her not a distant hero, but someone who had once stood exactly where they stood, who knew every sting of injury, every moment of being cornered, and still found a way forward. The fund's role quickly expanded as new cases came to light through the power of media and social networks. Many families sought help, not only for financial aid, but also for legal guidance and emotional support. Aisha and the advisory team built a network connecting reputable law firms, therapists, and community groups across multiple states, ensuring that no matter where victims were, they could access help. She also proposed organizing workshops and community training sessions on civil rights, self-protection, and how to record evidence when faced with injustice. The fund gradually became a comprehensive support center where no one was left behind simply because they lacked resources or a voice. Though the work was demanding and consumed much of her time, Aisha never allowed herself to step back because to her, this was not just a new mission after the courtroom victory, but the natural continuation of the journey she had begun, one meant to ensure that stories like hers would never again unfold in darkness. At the final community gathering of the year, Aisha stepped onto the stage amid prolonged applause and the warm yellow light spilling over rows of tightly packed seats. Her face was calm, yet her eyes radiated determination, each step toward the podium carrying the weight of the journey she had endured. When the microphone was handed to her, Aisha stood silent for a few seconds, letting the murmurs fade, then spoke in a low but steady voice. "Strength is not only in firing back, but in not letting them take away your dignity." The words left the room in complete stillness, as if everyone needed a few breaths to absorb their meaning. For Aisha, strength did not lie in impulsive reactions or retaliatory violence, but in the ability to preserve one's values under the harshest trials. She reminded them that had she let anger guide her that day, everything might have taken a different turn, leaving only a trail of regret. The eyes in the room were fixed on her, not as on a distant symbol, but as on someone who had walked through darkness to reclaim the light, a light she now sought to share and to guide those still struggling to stand firm. When the air had grown still, Aisha began urging people to stand up against injustice, not with isolated bursts of action, but persistence and organization. She spoke of the early days when her story was twisted, when an entire system tried to turn the truth into lies, and how she and her supporters had dismantled each layer of evidence cover-up. She stressed that every individual, no matter their starting point, had the power to create change if they knew how to use their voice and act at the right time and the right way. Remember that silence only strengthens the wrongdoer, she said, and sometimes a small piece of evidence, a timely word, can save a life. Aisha did not hide that this path was grueling, that confronting injustice could leave one isolated, attacked, or even hurt. But that was precisely why the solidarity of the community was essential. She called on people not only to show support once tragedy had struck, but to build protective networks, share skills and knowledge to prevent harm, so that no one would have to face an entire system alone. By the end, Aisha stepped away from the podium, but the applause did not stop. A group of high school students ran up to take a photo with her, saying her story had inspired them to start a civic rights club. A veteran shook her hand firmly, his eyes brimming with tears, whispering that he had regained his faith after years of silence. Elderly members of the community stood, giving her long embraces as if to pass on both gratitude and trust. Outside the hall, night had fully fallen, the cold wind slipping through every seam of clothing. Yet the crowd lingered, talking, exchanging contacts, and setting dates for the next meetings. Aisha stepped out, took a deep breath, feeling the chill sharpen her mind and graven the certainty that everything she had just said was not only for today, but a message that would echo for years to come. She knew the road ahead was still long, still full of challenges, but when she looked at the faces lit with determination, Aisha believed she was no longer alone, and that true strength had already begun to spread. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting a light golden layer on the path leading away from the hall where the gathering had just ended. Aisha stood there in no hurry to leave her eyes gazing into the distance, as if seeing through space to where memories of harsh days still lingered. The day's last breeze brushed her coat, the scent of rain-damp earth drifting from afar, mixing with a heartbeat that was slowing after hours of tension. Her face was serene, yet in her eyes lay a steady vitality, the very thing that had kept her standing through every turbulent wave. A few people noticed she was still there, quietly approached to shake her hand or smile, saying nothing more, as if everything had already been spoken through their eyes. That sense of peace was not an escape from reality, but the result of a long journey in which she had learned to let go of burdens, leaving behind the noise of prejudice and hatred. The slanting sunlight formed a thin halo around her hair like a frame anyone who saw would remember, for within it was not only a person who had overcome trials, but also a reminder that resilience can take the shape of stillness. Though Aisha's story had reached its conclusion in terms of events, the resonance it left behind began a new wave of influence. Her articles, videos, and speeches continued to be shared, becoming a source of inspiration for many distant communities she had never set foot in. People spoke not only of the incident, but also analyzed the way she chose to face injustice, how she turned pain into fuel for positive change. In community gatherings, her name was invoked as an example of rising after being struck down not through retaliation but through a persistent and humane strategy. Youth groups began organizing classes on civic rights, evidence documentation skills, and ways to support victims of abuse of power, all born from the spirit Aisha had sown. Many wrote her letters saying they had found the courage to protect themselves, or at least not to turn away when others faced injustice. Each word, each shared story extended her own, letting it live beyond its original intent, becoming part of a collective memory where anyone could find a measure of strength for themselves. In the years that followed, although Aisha chose to step away from the spotlight and return to a simpler life, the echoes of that journey remained with her. Whenever she passed by places places that had once witnessed the events she still received looks of respect, sometimes a slight nod from a stranger, as if the two shared a common secret. On human rights forums, her image in the afternoon light that day was still used to illustrate resilience, and her words about strength and dignity continued to be quoted as an opening to discussions. The story had closed on paper, but it kept unfolding in the lives of hundreds, even thousands of people, quietly shifting how they perceived justice and responsibility. Aisha understood that sometimes the greatest achievement was not winning in court, but having her story become part of everyday conversation so that another generation could walk more confidently, knowing they were not alone. And in the glow of each sunset, as everything sank into stillness, that echo remained like a slow but steady heartbeat, keeping the flame of justice alive in people's hearts. Aisha's story began on an afternoon that seemed ordinary as she left work to head home, carrying in the mindset of someone long accustomed to discipline and principles after years of military service. But waiting at the corner that day was a confrontation steeped in injustice with two police officers, Mark and Cole, who not only abused their power but acted with deep racial prejudice. What seemed at first like it would end after a few questions quickly escalated when insults were spoken. Contemptuous looks were laid bare, and violence erupted in an instant. The gunshot that rang out not only shook the small street but also awakened a chain of unforeseeable reactions, pushing everything far beyond the control of those who had started it. In the days that followed, Aisha faced a wave of pressure unlike anything she had ever experienced. The media reported in fragments, the story distorted by dishonest statements, while slow-moving legal procedures made it seem as if the situation was being deliberately dragged out to wear down the victim's spirit. Yet, unlike many others, Aisha had the will and experience not to retreat. She quietly worked with her lawyer, gathered evidence, and connected with witnesses willing to speak out. That persistence gradually opened a new front from social media security camera footage, and bystander phone videos began to spread, redrawing the entire picture of the incident with clarity, exposing the violence and contempt for the law shown by Mark and Cole. As the truth gradually emerged, the community no longer stood by. Human rights organizations, veterans associations, and countless individuals came together to create unprecedented pressure, forcing the authorities to respond. Peaceful marches, public hearings, and a series of press releases transformed Aisha's personal case into a national issue. The Department of Justice stepped in, federal politicians spoke out, and even within the police department, cracks appeared as some officers resigned in protest of the cover-up. In the midst of the storm, Aisha maintained a strategic silence, appearing only when necessary so that her words carried the greatest weight. The hearing before the city council became a turning point. For the first time in front of the public and live television cameras, Aisha recounted in detail the threats, the racial slurs, and the moment the gun went off. The crowd in the chamber could not contain its outrage, cheering each time she emphasized a key point. Meanwhile, Mark and Cole sat with their heads down, avoiding the gaze of those listening. Just days later, the council voted to hold them in custody pending trial, a decision widely regarded as a major victory for justice. From then on, the story was no longer just Aisha's. A wave of other victims came forward to share similar experiences, turning social media into a repository of hundreds of cases of abuse that had been forgotten. Aisha was invited to human rights conferences and community gatherings where she shared her story, not to elicit pity, but to encourage people to know their rights and speak up. At one veterans conference, she stressed the importance of documenting all evidence, not only to protect oneself, but also to protect the truth. That statement became a guiding principle for many campaigns advocating systemic reform. The reach continued to expand as a documentary about the case was produced. Her story entered law school textbooks, and Aisha became the face of a nationwide police reform campaign. Hundreds of letters of thanks poured in from across the country, from those who had regained faith in justice to young people who for the first time realized they too could stand up for what was right. When Mark and Cole were sentenced to prison, the police department was forced into comprehensive reform, and a fund to support victims of police violence was established with Aisha serving as an advisor. Everyone understood that this was not merely the end of a case, but the beginning of a movement. In her final speech before stepping away from the media spotlight, Aisha left behind a statement that would be remembered. Strength is not only in firing back, but in not letting them take away your dignity. Those words were not only for those who had experienced injustice, but for everyone living in a society where justice is sometimes tested. They served as a reminder that courage is shown not only in moments of confrontation, but also in the ability to restrain oneself, to remain whole, and to avoid becoming what one stands against. From Aisha's story, the greatest lesson is the importance of persistence and preparation. When facing injustice, emotional outbursts are natural but true. Victory comes from acting strategically, knowing how to use every tool to bring the truth to light. Documenting evidence, seeking community support, and maintaining consistent pressure are decisive factors. Furthermore, the story shows the power of connection one person can start, but to create lasting change requires the participation of many, from witnesses, journalists, and lawyers to ordinary citizens willing to take to the streets. Another equally important aspect is transforming personal experience into a shared value. Aisha not only sought justice for herself, but also used her story to push for reforms that would help others avoid similar situations. This transformation turned a private pain into a collective driving force, and that is why her story continues to be told, studied, and applied. It stands as proof that even in the worst circumstances, there can still be an opportunity to create something better. Now, though she has chosen a quieter life, the image of Aisha in that late afternoon sunlight remains vivid in many people's memories, not because it looked like a beautiful photograph, but because it carried a profound message. True strength is sometimes neither loud nor showy, but quiet and enduring, like the last light of day that keeps shining patiently even as darkness spread. And perhaps it is that endurance which allows the story's echo to last, inspiring each person in their own moment to rise and defend justice and preserve dignity, something no one has the right to take away.